Secretary Castro, thanks for joining me today. Coronavirus cases we just talked about are rapidly rising in Texas. There's been a dramatic shift in recent weeks. Initially, there weren't as many cases, and now we're seeing that shift. What's led to this moment in Texas?
There's several things that I don't think were done right when the state reopened. Number one, the state reopened too early. Secondly, when it reopened, it didn't have the two things in place that medical experts tell us you need to have in place to safely reopen. Number one, sufficient testing. We ranked 48th per capita in testing around the time when we reopened the state. And then secondly, contact tracing. There wasn't sufficient army of folks out there doing contact tracing in Texas. And that hadn't even started. It was just getting ramped up. Mm-hmm. And then third, the governor went ahead and reopened, did it without sufficient testing, contact tracing, and then did not allow local communities, San Antonio, Austin, Houston, Dallas, and so forth, to tailor their own safety precautions. There were a number of communities that wanted to require masks, for instance. He said, no, this state order supersedes all of your local orders. The state is taking over. And what we've seen is a huge spike in infections and hospitalizations. The capacity of hospitals in several of these big communities, especially, is getting closer and closer to full. So there's a cause for concern right now.
And on the issue of masks, even though some of the county officials have started to say that they're mandating them for businesses, do you think that there should be a statewide mandate for masks for the public, not just businesses?
I think that we should do a statewide mandate. And I say that because for rural communities, even though it's true that the density, of course, is less and you see a lower infection rate, they also have a lot less hospital capacity. And what we're concerned about in many communities is the hospital capacity once infections start rolling, once those things start multiplying. So in many ways, these rural communities have to be even more careful, because you get people out there who are an hour or more away from any real healthcare provider. If somebody is asymptomatic, for instance, and then they suddenly have an episode, which is one of the patterns for some people, health patterns, they're asymptomatic or barely have any symptoms, and then all of a sudden, within an hour or two, they plunge into a real life-threatening episode with coronavirus. Mm-hmm. They can't get to a hospital. So they have to be very careful. I think we should do that at least until the level of testing and contact tracing is sufficient so that we're comfortable and we stabilize the capacity at these hospitals.
During this pandemic, we've also seen a disproportionate impact on a number of minority populations, a disproportionate impact on African Americans, and more recently, increased cases among Latinos. Are you seeing that also in Texas? And are adequate measures being taken to address these disproportionately hit populations?
We have started to see that here in Texas. And, that was a very good article that you put together that looked at different communities and with a focus on the Latino community in the United States. As you noted in your article, it's a little bit harder to tell in Texas because there hasn't been reporting based on race and ethnicity for many of the cases, either the infections or the deaths. So it's harder to tell, but that does seem to be a trend here as well, for all of the reasons that you and others have noted. The fact that so many folks in the Latino community and the African American community are essential workers. They're grocery store workers, they're fast food workers, they're meat plant workers, they're farm workers. Many of them cannot work remotely. For Latinos, I know that the figure was that only about 16% could actually work remotely. You also noted, and others have noted, that Latinos tend to live oftentimes in multi-generational households. I know that. I grew up with my grandmother living, and taking care of my brother and me. That makes it harder if somebody in the household gets infected with the virus to be able to quarantine, and there's a greater risk of getting more people infected. For all of those reasons, we do see some of that here in Texas, but it is harder to tell because it's more opaque. The reporting just isn't there.
Right. There is a lot of data still missing. The pandemic is also has led to millions of unemployment claims, struggles to pay rent. We're coming up on a moratorium, the deadline where there could be mass eviction notices sent to people who are having trouble finding work. What actions are you pushing to address that, and why have you taken this on?
Yeah, this country, it really is headed for this perfect storm of misery in the next few weeks. All of the job losses, the health impact of COVID-19, the country grappling with the continuing legacy of bigotry, discrimination, following the tragic murder of George Floyd. And now, after the federal protection on some evictions runs out in late July, as well as a lot of these statewide protections or city protections that have been in place, when those run out, that $1,200 stimulus check for many people is in the rearview mirror now. It's not, that's not doing much to help you 2 months down the line. And unemployment benefits are going to run out. So what that means is you're going to have millions of people who are facing eviction. They will have a complaint filed against them in a housing court to evict them, and the process will begin. They're going to face essentially homelessness, maybe doubling up with relatives, maybe finding shelter, in a facility in their hometown, or some of them sleeping on the street. That's what we're facing right now. Already, we had millions of Americans that couldn't make the rent payment in June, and even more that say they're not going to be able to make it in July. So it's just getting worse. What we have to do about it is, number one, pass that HEROES Act, which has $100 billion in direct rental assistance. We also should do another stimulus to help people to get by, and also extend unemployment benefits for folks.
In addition to the pandemic, as you know, you just referenced it, the unprecedented protests that we're seeing in response to police brutality, in response to systemic racism, all sparked after the killing of George Floyd. And the attitudes of the American electorate have actually shifted really dramatically in the span of the last month in terms of systemic racism. Just one stat I want to read off to you is that 76% of Americans now say that racial and ethnic discrimination is a big problem. And 71% of white people agree with that statement. So what is Joe Biden's role as the Democratic nominee in this moment? And do you feel as though he's meeting it?
Well, first of all, as President Obama pointed out yesterday, I don't think there's anybody better to try and heal the country right now than Joe Biden. He has both a wealth of experience in policymaking, but also more importantly in life, and a character that Americans have come to know. People trust him. They believe in him. And I think that compared to Donald Trump, Joe Biden is going to try and bring this country together. That's one of the things that's really been missing during this very crazy and unprecedented 2020. We truly see, and it's been revealed, how absent of leadership we are in the Oval Office, and the fact that this is a president that just is not up to the job and is not making any real effort to try and bring people together. Joe Biden has been all about trying to bring people together. When it comes more specifically to the issue that a lot of people are protesting about, which is policing, right. He has announced a series of reforms that represent a down payment, as President Obama described it yesterday, on the changes that we need to make to this system, from banning chokeholds and strangleholds to a national use of force standard to better transparency and accountability. So this is going down the road that we need to go down to make real progress.
One of the reforms that's a part of his package is one that he had introduced during the primary, and it's to allocate some $300 million to the community policing service, the COPS program. Do you think that that's the right direction to take? It's been met with some criticism from a number of activists that are helping lead the Black Lives Matter movement.
Look, I think that when I was a city councilman and mayor, I had the opportunity to work with folks that were doing community policing. I certainly believe that that is a better model than what a lot of local communities have in place. I'm thinking specifically about the militarization of our police. Mm-hmm. You know, Joe Biden has called for an end to this program that gives these weapons of war to police departments, these combat vehicles that you see rolling down the street, dealing with protesters, which just has no place there. So, you know, if we're going to transition and if we're going to reimagine law enforcement, then I believe that, you know, a good step is to move away from the militarization of police and to support policing that actually engages community. I do think also that in this fiscal budget year in local communities and in the years to come, mm-hmm. there is an opportunity, and cities should look at how they can invest in more mental health professionals, more social workers, more housing professionals, and housing opportunity, so that police officers are not the ones that are dealing with somebody who is homeless on the streets or an individual who has a mental health issue. Often they're stigmatized as being violent when the vast majority of people with mental health issues are not violent. Mm-hmm. You know, we can reimagine law enforcement. And like I said, I do think that this is a good down payment on those changes, what the vice president has proposed. And local communities and the federal government can reimagine law enforcement in the years to come.
You, when you were running as one of Joe Biden's opponents during the primary, you put out a very aggressive police reform plan. That was actually one of your key pillars. Have you been advising Joe Biden on this issue at all? And if there's one element of that plan that you would hope he would adopt or push throughout the rest of the election, which one is it?
You know, he and I have not spoken about it, but our teams have spoken. Look, I think he's on the right track. There are several things he's already put forward that we put forward as part of our plan. He's already talked about a national use of force standard. He's talked about demilitarizing the police. He's talked about banning chokeholds and strangleholds and increasing accountability. So he's on the right track. You know, all of these things are important. It's also important, and I believe he will, support local communities who are going to engage in that reimagination of what public safety looks like. Mayors like London Breed out in San Francisco that are trying to rethink, when do you actually need a traditional police officer and when do you not? There's so many times when we use circumstances, when we use an armed cop today, that we don't need to. And you can both have better quality of life, keep people safe, and save money that can then be invested in libraries, in housing opportunity, in mental health care, and so many other things that boost upward mobility and quality of life, instead of just sending an armed cop to every situation.
On the broader election, 2020 election, a few days ago, Senator Klobuchar bowed out of the VP contention. And when she did, she said that she thought that Biden should select a woman of color to be his vice president. Do you agree with that statement?
Well, I mean, I think that would be fantastic, but that's a decision that the vice president himself is going to make. And as somebody that has been through the process, I can say that the vice presidential selection process is unlike anything else in American politics. And, you know, it's a decision that solely belongs to that nominee, who needs to make a decision about who they can work well with, who they think would be a great partner in governance, you know, obviously who also can help win the election. But ultimately, who is best prepared, God forbid, that that person ever needed to step in and become the president.
Well, let me try it another way. You endorsed Elizabeth Warren, after you dropped out. Do you think, and she is in contention, do you think that she should be selected?
I think it would be tremendous. I mean, she would be a spectacular vice president if she were selected. You know, I have tremendous respect for her. That's why I endorsed her right after I got out of the race. And so, again, you know, I'm not going to get in the middle of that selection process, except to say that that Joe Biden has so many great options to choose from. And that's a testament to the talent, the ability, the accomplishment of so many women in public service at the national level, at the state level, that are able to step up and take on that role. And that's overdue. And frankly, I'm glad that he's doing it.
In terms of the electorate and breaking down the Democratic electorate, Biden's been criticized a bit for his Latino outreach. Do you think that does he need Latinos to win, and is he doing enough to motivate them to come to the polls in November?
Yeah, I mean, in order to win, Vice President Biden is going to energize a broad-based coalition of people that absolutely must include the Latino community. A lot of people, when they think of the Latino community, they think of its importance in states like California, Texas, New York, Florida. It's also important in states that are going to be swing states. There's a growing Latino community in Michigan, in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania. And of course, Florida is one of the most Latino states in the United States. So no matter how you slice up that electoral map, appealing to the Latino community is absolutely essential. The vice president's campaign gets that. They're making big investments in Latino outreach in both English and Spanish. And they've brought on more Latinas and Latinos on the staff. They're doing traditional outreach and then also digital outreach and every way that they can to try and appeal to the Latino community. And I think doing it in a way that is respectful and recognizes that you have differences among Latinos. As you know, not all Latinos are the same. There are a lot of differences by region, by national origin, a number of different, by generation, right, and immigration status. And I think they get that.
Some of the other decisions that were big, I guess, developments that came this past week. One was concerning the Supreme Court's decision on DACA and their decision to block, at least temporarily, Trump's reversal of that program. What are your, I guess, thoughts on that ruling by the conservative court in terms of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program?
Well, I mean, my first emotion was I was breathing a sigh of relief for more than 700,000 dreamers out there that have been on pins and needles waiting to see what happens. This is the only country most of them have known as their own. They're American in every way that you can be American. And they were facing a Trump administration that turned its back on them after Donald Trump said he would take care of them, that they would not get deported. He jumped in and, supported an effort to strip them of these protections. And now what we're left with is this is a temporary solution. The court, thankfully said, no, you can't get rid of DACA the way that you tried to, but it said you can't get rid of DACA because you violated the requirements of the Administrative Procedure Act. In other words, you didn't jump through the right hoops under the law to be able to repeal this. But that means that either Donald Trump or somebody in the future, if there's not a permanent solution, could jump through those hoops and could repeal DACA. The good thing is that Joe Biden understands this. He has long committed to make the DREAM Act a legislative reality. He supports that. He has committed to doing that at the beginning of his administration. And I believe that he'll follow through on that if he's elected.
And also in terms of DACA and the politics surrounding it, similar to the movement around Black Lives, we have seen a dramatic shift from the American public. Not that recently, it's been that way for a few years, but in their support of protections for DACA recipients. Trump has been pushing still the dismantling of the program. What, I guess, have you heard from, Texans in terms of their views of the future of this program and whether or not it rules how they vote in November?
I mean, yeah, the general public, I think, out there, whether you're talking about Democrats, independents, or Republicans, the majority of people support finding a pathway to citizenship so that these DACA recipients can remain in the United States, keep contributing, in the workplace, in the military, through schooling, every way that they're doing it. 30,000 of them are frontline healthcare workers, by the way, right now. Mm-hmm. But, I think there's still a lot of anxiety among DACA recipients because the future is uncertain. That legislative fix is not there. We got close in 2013 when 68 senators voted for immigration reform, but it stalled out in the House. Have Republicans learned that lesson? Even if Democrats win, will Republicans support getting the DREAM Act done and more broadly reforming our immigration laws so that we have common sense immigration policy? That's still up in the air. But the best thing that people can do for those people who are eligible to vote is to get out there and to vote and to send people who will step up and make those changes in Congress. And even if, it's somebody from the other party, a Republican, that you're not going to vote for, you need to make it close, so that they get a strong message that it's time to move on this issue.
On immigration, that was another big policy issue for you when you ran in the primary. You called on your fellow Democrats to support the decriminalization of border crossings. Would you hope that, or would you like Biden to endorse that proposal?
Well, look, Vice President Biden has his own immigration plan, and he and I agree on 99% of it. And I think that the immigration plan that he has, if he can put it in place, is going to make a huge world of difference. I mean, what you have in Donald Trump is somebody with a dark heart toward immigrants and somebody who has been treating migrants cruelly, trying in every way that he can to rid, and I use that verb intentionally, I think that's how at least some people in his administration see it, rid this country of the Latino community, Latino immigrants. Whereas Vice President Biden welcomes immigrants, he recognizes their value, and he's going to do everything that he can, not only to roll back the bad stuff that Donald Trump has done, but to actually move forward and do what we hope, that a Democratic president would, which is to make life easier for these migrants, and to set up an orderly immigration system and a pathway to citizenship for people. So, the vast majority of things we're on the same page about.
I want to go back to coronavirus for a second, and that's that recently the administration started floating an idea that the new outbreaks were because of recent travel from Mexico to these parts of the United States. Have you seen any evidence of that in these surges, these new cases in Texas?
I have not seen that, and I always get suspicious when sometimes politicians begin to use people coming across the border as a boogeyman. We had a long history in this state of people suggesting that immigrants are bringing over disease and all sorts of things. So this is nothing new, and I have not seen any evidence that that's true. What I do know is that Trump's Remain in Mexico policy, for instance, which is unprecedented and requiring people who simply want to seek asylum, as they're entitled to do, to stay in Mexico instead of being able to stay here in the United States until their asylum case is adjudicated. They are in migrant tent camps along the border, in squalid conditions, exposed to the elements, higher coronavirus rates, and also exposed to extortion, kidnapping, violent crimes, sometimes including rape, sometimes including murder. So, you know, the point of fact is that the policies of this administration have actually become a danger, a physical danger to people trying to seek asylum, you know, trying to come into the border, and not the other way around.
And then I have another question on this moment right now around systemic racism. And one of the tensions that's emerged among Democrats is around between activists as well as more establishment Democrats, and that's around this idea of defunding the police. What do you think of when you hear defund the police? And do you feel as though the two visions that these parts of the Democratic Party have are actually in that much of, or are actually that disconnected?
No, you know, I get what activists are saying when they say defund the police. Look, the fact is that I don't think anybody is calling for or believes that tomorrow we're not going to have any money that we give to police departments in this country. Okay, you're in a time when you still need traditional policing. Okay, but what it says is it's an aspiration. In the short term, immediate things that we can do, and also in the long term. In the short term, it means, hey, if you're a mayor or city council out there, realize that we over-police today. Why do you need to send an armed cop when two people have a fender bender, nobody's hurt, nobody's arguing or violent, but they just need to fill out an insurance report for liability purposes? Why do you need to send an armed cop just because somebody is homeless, sleeping on the street? Why do you need to send an armed cop a lot of times when somebody has a mental health challenge? The vast majority of people with a mental health issue are not violent. That's a stigma that's associated with them, but the fact is that most of them are not. You can send a mental health professional. That interaction would be more productive because they understand how to deal with that person and relate to them and resources that might be available to them. If somebody's homeless, you can send a social worker or housing professional. This is being done all the time with a housing first policy in communities across the country where there was an aggressive effort to get out and provide services to homeless individuals and provide them permanent housing. You have a whole cadre of people in our country and cities that know how to do this. We don't need to send an armed traditional police officer into a lot of situations that we use them for now. So reimagine public safety. Take some of that money and put it into mental health care, into housing opportunity, into literacy. Realize the opportunity costs of spending so much on armed police officers when you don't need to. That's what I think about when I think of this slogan, defund the police. And the last thing I'll say about that is, look, activists have a role to play. And so I applaud activists who have put out there a vision. You know, elected officials also have a role to play. You know, that's a separate, distinct role that they have to play. And so I encourage elected officials to scrutinize their budgets and to scrutinize the police budget as much as they would scrutinize the public works budget or parks and rec budget. They need to anyway, because the coronavirus has rocked their budgets. Revenues are down across the board, from sales taxes to property taxes to hotel occupancy taxes. And then in the long term, do that reimagining so that you can get closer, we can all get closer to the day when we're actually boosting people up and not just turning them around and handcuffing them, or even worse, when we don't need to.
So quickly, now that there are far more elected officials talking about this issue than there ever have been before, in terms of really scrutinizing whether or not to reimagine policing, do you see real change happening in the near term? Or do you think it's going to take a little bit longer to get to that point?
No, I mean, we'll see some change in the near term, sure. I mean, a good example of that happened on Juneteenth in Colorado. Governor Jared Polis announced that They were ending qualified immunity across the state, banning chokeholds, increasing accountability and transparency for police officers. You know, in a number of different cities, they're reviewing use of force policies. Some of them have already changed their policies. And more deeply than that, in terms of reimagining public safety, look at places like San Francisco, where Mayor London Breed is leading an effort to do exactly what I talked about. Instead of just reflexively sending an armed police officer into these situations where actually another type of professional would be more helpful, both to the person that they're dealing with and to our quality of life as a society, they're going to do that. So you have some powerful examples of cities and of leaders that are showing us how we can do it. And I would encourage, you know, policymakers at every level to, if you're a mayor, look at what London Breed is doing. If you're a governor, look at what Jared Polis is doing. And if you're in Congress or running for Congress, look at the Justice and Policing Act, and then think through what can we do in the medium and long term after these things.
Okay. Thank you, Secretary Castro. Is there anything else you want to add or?
No, you know, I just, you know, thanks a lot for having me. And, you know, this is such a unprecedented, unusual time period. And we just have the confluence of so many economic, social, political dynamics. It's one for the history books. And thanks for inviting me to speak a little bit to it.